Compass. We look forward to receiving your input and feedback, and we hope that today's presentations will provide some insights into some of the details that I think we need to work towards in further refining and enhancing our capacity to respond effectively to petroleum shortages. We have had a change in our lineup for today's presenters. Alexander Marisi of the Michigan Agency for Energy has found himself very tied up in a 3-day intensive exercise that he's become very engaged with, and he's asked me to kind of fill in for him. And I will do that last and talk a little bit about some of the frameworks that we've designed and what we might use in the future. And so with that, I'd like to begin today's presentation with Joe Costa. Joe is a petroleum planner with the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities. He's been working in this area for quite some time and was a key player in the response, the state's response to Hurricane Sandy. So I'd like to turn it over to Joe at this time.
Thanks, Jeff. I hope everyone can hear me. So today I'll be discussing New Jersey's fuel plan, which is now part of our State Emergency Operations Plan. I have two short slides, presentations that I'll be presenting. One is on the fuel plan itself, and the other one is on our resiliency plan for retail gas stations. So let's get started. The fuel plan is actually officially the New Jersey Petroleum Task Force Plan. I hope you can see that on your screens. Energy emergency responsibilities. Who's responsible for the fuel plan? In New Jersey, the State Board of Public Utilities is the ESF 12 agency. It's responsible not only for the fuel plan, but also emergency functions. So typically during an energy emergency, ESF 12 functions are supported by, as you can see, the Office of Emergency Management, the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities is supported also by DEP, New Jersey DOT, and our Homeland Security Office. So typically what happens during an emergency, these agencies will converge at the ROC, which is the Regional Operations Intelligence Center, and emergency management staff will work in concert to manage the event. So to our next slide. The purpose and scope of the plan. So essentially the Petroleum Task Force Plan establishes a process for State Emergency Operations Center coordination of emergency fuel needs during a declared state of emergency. The fuel plan was created after Superstorm Sandy and is an annex to the State Emergency Operations Plan. It provides a process for key stakeholders to work together to ensure that the public sector needs are met, and also, when appropriate, it also extends to the private sector. If I were to explain in one bullet the plan, it's just essentially a fuel plan that creates a centralized single point of contact to serve as the clearinghouse for all requests and issues related to statewide fuel emergencies and emergency distribution. So what are the key steps to executing the plan? We feel it's very important to establish a database of petroleum supply chain facilities and emergency contacts along those facilities. Establish a pre-activation stakeholder notification process. Establish a procedure for activating the plan. And obviously, we have to execute the plan itself. So the database. So to ensure that the fuel plan is executable, we need to create and maintain a database of petroleum supply chain facilities and emergency contacts at those locations. So at a minimum, the database will include all working refineries, major pipeline storage tank facilities, bulk terminal facilities, and obviously the rack terminals. Then the pre-activation stakeholder process. The BPU, with the assistance of the DEP, the Office of Emergency Management, and our Homeland Security Office, We'll also create a notification and contact list of key individuals responsible for actually moving the product down the supply chain. So at a minimum, we're looking at a list that will include prime suppliers, owners, operators of refineries, storage terminals, major pipelines, distributors and transporters of motor fuel, and to a certain extent, we reach out to the retail station owners through their representatives. Here in New Jersey, we have the Fuel Merchants Association, and we also have the New Jersey Convenience Store Association. They represent those groups, and they're the best way to communicate with those groups. So, fuel plan activation. When do we activate the fuel plan? So, activation of the fuel plan will be initiated by the SEOC, which is the State Emergency Operations Center Command, upon a recommendation from the ESF-12 coordinator, which is our agency, the BPU. So once the decision has been made for fuel plan activation, all the fuel emergency requests will be handled by a fuel team. So this fuel team will be assembled, headed up by the BPU staff, and assisted with our support agencies, which are OEM, Homeland Security Office, DEP, and others. So the fuel team will be centralized at a single point in the SEOC, which again is the Regional Operations Center, our fusion center, and will be tasked with managing all emergency fuel needs and related issues concerning emergency fuel distribution. So this is my favorite part of the slide, which is, I know we're going to get a little bit into the weeds here, but bear with me for a second. This is our petroleum supply chain here in New Jersey, and obviously your state's supply or other states' supply chains look a little bit different. But to execute a fuel plan, first and foremost, we need to understand how the products move through this supply chain. So we're talking about from the point where it enters the state to its final destination. This means identifying the key sources of supply, the storage facilities, and knowing who the distributors are. Also, we need to know physically where these locations are, and we need to identify key contacts along these points. Finally, if we know how the petroleum products move through the state, it also gives us some insight on where we may experience some bottleneck problems that disrupt the flow. To give you an example, if you look at the top of the diagram, you'll see that New Jersey has multiple sources of supply. We have pipelines, in-state refineries, and marine shipments, along with some rail. It's unlikely, here in New Jersey at least, it's unlikely that a disruption in any single source will have a significant impact on the entire supply chain because we do have diversity in supply. As an example, we had, I'm sure all of you recall, we had the Colonial explosion in Alabama sometime last year, and although it was disrupted for some time, we didn't experience any physical supply chain disruptions here in New Jersey. However, as we move further down the supply chain, things can get a little more complicated. If you look at this diagram again, we have basically two storage tank ownership types. We have the integrated oil systems, oil companies like Sunoco, and we also have specialized storage and transportation companies like Buckeye and NewStore. So the number of stakeholder individuals we need to communicate during the emergency event gets much bigger and much more complicated as we move down the chain. So the point here is, so understanding what happens at the terminal facilities becomes extremely important during an emergency. Basically, this is where most of the product converges and changes hand. As you all probably know, this is where petroleum gets sold. This is where petroleum gets resold. It gets blended. It's also where the distributors, wholesalers, the jobbers, and everyone else picks up their supply to deliver to the final point of sale or to the final destination. So knowing who owns these terminals and who controls these terminals, what product is moved in and out of the facilities, who the prime suppliers are, and here in New Jersey we have quite a large list of prime suppliers. It becomes particularly important, and all these questions need to be answered in order to execute the fuel plan. If you recall earlier in the presentation, I talked about the database. So this just reinforces the need for a database. So I'm going to pause here, and I'd like to go to the next slide presentation that I have, which covers the retail program that we created. This program was something that was created after Sandy, and it addresses our retail side. So basically, like most states that were impacted by Sandy, we received FEMA grants, and we created what we call the Retail Fuel Station Energy Resiliency Program. So basically, this program was created from lessons learned from Sandy. Reasons for creating the program were obviously we lost quite a bit of power locally to about 70% of the retail stations in the northern part of New Jersey. With only a few stations operating for about a 2-week period, we were forced to implement odd-even in 12 of our counties. That odd-even process went in about a week into the recovery of the storm. So we acted pretty quickly, but we still experienced quite a bit of congestion and long lines at the pump. So what is the retail program about? It's a voluntary program. The program awards grants to gas station owners for installation of either a quick connect device capable of connecting to a portable generator or the installation of a permanent generator. The program was funded through Sandy related FEMA money, and grants were awarded by our state economic development authority. So the basic eligibility for the program are, as you can see, awards for both quick connects and for backup generators. Storage retail stations with a capacity of 18,000 to 35,000 were awarded $15,000 for a quick connect. Stations with a capacity of 35,000 gallons were eligible for $65,000 towards the installation of a backup generator. There's also an exception. Retail stations must sell both gasoline and diesel, except for in locations where they are within a quarter mile an evacuation route. The station is still eligible. So the program participation and final completion date. Let's see, as of May 1st, 2016, the participants were told to submit all their projects by that date, and as of October 2016, we received a total of 127 applicants, which were approved, and 47 were generators and 80 were quick connects. And they're pretty widely dispersed throughout the state, as you can see from this map. They cover both the northern part of the state, the central, and also the southern part of the state. So with that concludes the 2 PowerPoints, and I'll take any questions if anyone has any.
For anyone that would like to ask questions, there's a dialog box available on the right-hand side of your screen. You can type your questions in there, and if we don't answer them right away, we'll certainly take them at the end of the presentations. Joe, I just had one question in terms of the Quick Connect station setups. Do you have an inventory of generators that then can be deployed to those stations potentially, or how would that aspect of that work?
Yes, Jeff, I'm glad you asked that. I forgot to mention, as part of the program, we were able to purchase 50 generators that are deployed throughout the state at strategic locations, and our Office of Emergency Management handles that. So during a state of emergency, if a gas station who participated in the program calls up and wants a generator, we would deliver that generator.
Very good. Thank you for that clarification. I don't see any questions here, so let's move on with our next presentation. Deanna Henry, who is the Emergency Manager for the Oregon Department of Energy, has been working for some time now to update their fuels plans. Understanding it's pending final approval at this point, but she's going to give us an overview of some of the plans. They have some unique challenges in Oregon. There was a major exercise held last year, the purpose of which was to examine the impact of a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake, which could occur in the Pacific off the coast of Oregon and Washington State. Experts predict that earthquake could be as large as an 8.5 magnitude earthquake. And in addition to the damage caused by the earthquake itself, there's certainly some risk of a tsunami that could inundate the coastal shoreline. So a pretty significant event. They've been working pretty hard to be better prepared for that. And I'd like to turn over to Deanna Henry at this point. Deanna.
Thanks, Jeff. Can everybody hear me? Well, the Oregon Fuel Plan does have many of the same components that Joe covered in the New Jersey plan, so I'll focus specifically on our response strategies to a catastrophic earthquake and tsunami. Jeff, I'm having problems controlling my PowerPoint. Oh, here we go. Okay, sorry about that. A Cascadia subduction zone would certainly result in a state declared emergency for us, and under the governor's resource management powers, she can control, restrict, and regulate the use of fuel in the aftermath of a catastrophic earthquake. And it is our agency, the Oregon Department of Energy's responsibility to develop and maintain a statewide contingency plan and strategies to ensure that adequate fuel supplies are available to maintain emergency services, our transportation systems, the operation of the economy, and to protect the welfare of our residents as long as an emergency exists. So our plan does include an executive order to be signed by the governor when needed, authorizing our agency to implement all the strategies that we have identified in our plan. And a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake and tsunami would devastate our region's petroleum supply and distribution system. So Oregon is expected to lose more than 90% of the state's normal incoming supply, if not more. So our plan identifies strategies for bringing bulk fuel into the state, knowing where it needs to go, who needs it, and how we would get it there to support emergency response and recovery activities in the impacted communities. Our plan does identify 9 priority actions that our agency will take to begin the recovery of the petroleum infrastructure in the aftermath of a catastrophic earthquake. And these strategies include procedures for how we would work with industry and our federal partners to assess damages to the region's petroleum supply and distribution system and estimating repair times. We do expect our systems to be down for 3 months, if not longer. And as well as we do identify how we would work with state agencies, counties, and tribes to assess the fuel needs of these priority fuel users. We would also coordinate with federal and military partners to deliver bulk fuel to pre-designated fuel points of distribution throughout our state. And the actions also identify procedures for getting fuel sector information out to stakeholders through backup communication strategies, as well as issuing fuel conservation measures, securing fuel waivers, implementing the odd-even fuel allocation program, and many of the other fuel-related measures that Joe had covered in the New Jersey plan. But some of the things that we have done for our plan is for each of the 9 actions in our plan, we identified timelines for initiating and completing our priority missions. These are just guidelines or targets that we'd like to shoot for. Whether we can actually achieve our 9 actions in the specific timeframes identified for each of them will be heavily dependent on the actual event conditions. We also completed a mission analysis similar to what the military does for each of our 9 primary actions. For example, you're looking at the mission analysis for action 4, where we would determine available in-state supplies to perform initial life-saving missions, assess our statewide fuel needs, and establish our priorities for fuel. We identified facts and assumptions about the event conditions, as well as identified the constraints and limitations that would prevent us or make it difficult for us to accomplish our missions and objectives. And finally, in our mission analysis, we identified gaps and or information that is needed to assist us in completing our mission and objectives for each of the actions. And we found that many of the gaps and information needs we identified can and should be addressed now before Cascadia occurs to ensure that we have what we need to complete our mission and objectives after Cascadia hits. Our plan also provides protocols for activating our agency operations center and procedures for each of our response positions. Each of the response position procedures do include key objectives, a checklist of tasks, guidance to complete and accomplish our tasks and objectives, and reference materials to assist in those tasks for each of the 9 actions for each response position. So implementing our plan in response to a catastrophic event would require the support of our entire agency, and this slide simply shows our response structure for a full activation of our agency operations center. Unfortunately, in a Cascadia scenario, we are likely to lose up to 50% of our staff due to injuries and loss of life. Most state buildings in Oregon are not seismically sound, ours included. So some of the state projections for workforce impacts look really grim. Along the coast, we expect 80 to 90% of state employees will be unavailable to work in the first 3 days. In the valley where our office is located, we expect 40 to 50% of state employees will be out of commission. And as we move further away to central and eastern Oregon, about 20% of state workers are expected to be impacted. So these projections cause our agency to start thinking for the first time about developing a devolution plan to ensure the continuity of essential functions in the loss or incapacitation of our primary staff and our facilities. So if needed, we would transfer authority and responsibility of our fuel plan to staff located in Bend, Oregon, Olympia, Washington, or to our nuclear safety division staff who routinely work from the Tri-Cities in southeastern Washington. That's to make sure that we're able to allocate fuel to the state's emergency and essential services providers. And allocating fuel to this population is a huge undertaking. Oregon does have nearly 120 state agencies with varying degrees of emergency response duties. The state has 36 counties with more than 240 cities. Each jurisdiction has their own emergency and essential services providers. And then we have the 9 federally recognized tribes. Our agency would easily be overwhelmed if we were to receive fuel requests from all of these entities individually. So we have streamlined our process and designed a structure for fuel allocation that can actually be managed. So now those who qualify for emergency fuel fall under 3 categories. These are our pre-approved priority fuel users. We already know who they are. They are the 18 ESF primary state agencies overseeing critical sectors and Lifeline services. We have our 36 counties and our 9 federally recognized tribes. And all of our fuel requests will be filtered through one of these pre-approved priority fuel users. And we've been working with these folks for a long time. So all of our priority users have identified critical missions and have a general understanding of the fuel needed to conduct their critical missions. We also wanted our priority users to know where all of the fueling locations are within their response area and service territory. So to make this easier for our priority users, we have developed a fuel database listing all above ground and underground storage tanks in the state by county. You're looking at an example of Wheeler County. This is one of our smaller counties and can actually fit their whole database on one page. So the database lists the owner and operator's names, their physical address, latitude and longitude locations, the number of tanks on site, tank size, fuel type, and backup power capabilities. But I have to say, out of the over 9,000 locations that we have in the state, only about 200 of them actually have backup power. So our database is used for two primary functions. It provides information about in-state fuel stockpiles to be used by our priority fuel users so they can conduct initial life safety missions until we can deliver incoming bulk fuel supplies from outside of the region. And then from our auto fuel database, the counties are working to pre-designate fuel points that they would have to receive our bulk fuel supplies when it's available. And during our exercises that we participated in this last year, we learned that the most viable way to move fuel initially after a catastrophic earthquake is by air due to the widespread damage and debris affecting the highways, roadways, railways, and waterways. But we want to focus continually on restoring our highways, roads, and bridges because that's essential to our ability to gain a sustained response. So the Oregon Department of Energy has identified priority lifeline routes for restoration. These routes will guide our initial repairs on the transportation, power, and communication systems so that we can reconnect major population bases and ultimately support the delivery of fuel and other disaster relief supplies to the impacted communities by road. And so in light of that, we've asked each county to identify local priority lifeline routes that would link to the state lifeline routes to facilitate fuel deliveries to their communities. And here is an example of one county, Marion County's lifeline routes, as well as their 9 pre-designated fuel points. And Marion County understands that most likely after a catastrophic earthquake, their county will be split into 9 individual islands of population. So they have designated fuel points at each one of the islands, based on their bridge vulnerabilities and such. So they have 9 fuel points. So today we've collected information from 23 of the 36 counties on their priority lifeline routes and fuel points, and we're continuing our work with the remaining 13 counties to get this information completed. Another component of our plan that I want to talk about is our pre-drafted mission assignments, or some people call them prescripted missions, for each of our 9 actions. And here is an example of some of the missions to support our fuel allocation strategies. We learned from Cascadia Rising that we needed to identify the type and level of support we might need well before an emergency occurs. It wasn't enough for us just to tell folks that we need fuel and laugh of it. The federal logistics teams asked us, what do you want? How much do you want? And where do you want it? So, and our response was, well, what do you have? It's difficult to craft a need, we found, that into a viable resource request when it's unclear what capabilities exist and what are available to support our fuel needs. So it's a fine balance. So since the exercise last June, we've been working with the military department to learn more about the types of capabilities that could support the fuel strategies in our plan. And here are some of the examples of our mission assignments. So we're going to ask for fuel testing kits to test fuel quality for water seepage and other impurities at our pre-designated fuel points in the impacted communities to determine fuel condition and tank integrity. We'll also request fuel deliveries by air to the pre-designated fuel points in the counties until our roadway transportation corridors are viable. And we want mobile fueling capabilities to support road, utility, and communications crews that are on the move, tasked with restoring our priority lifeline routes, our power and communications systems. And then once state and county priority Lifeline routes are viable, we would request bulk fuel deliveries overland to our fuel points. And then we'll also be prepared to request infrastructure and operational support for portable fuel tank farms at some of our staging areas. Those are examples about our missions for the air and road. We do also have some examples of our mission assignments for rail and the waterway. We're prepared to request the use of available barges to store and offload fuel to support emergency and response activities along the Columbia River. We want to be able to request maritime assets to deliver fuel supplies and establish and operate portable fueling locations to support our activities along the Oregon coast. And we would also be ready to request the lifting of the Jones Act to allow foreign vessels to deliver bulk fuel supplies to our Oregon ports. We might likely not be the ones to request this, but if that hasn't been done, there's a mission assignment ready to go for that. And then finally, we'll be ready to request rail cars to transport, store, and offload fuel to support our activities along the Columbia River and all the way into Portland. Again, this is only a sample of our missions. We developed them with the best information we have at this point as we gain new or better information about the fuel capabilities and as we continue to vet our fuel strategies in our plan. We do plan to add more to our existing menu of mission assignments, as well as we'll be ready to modify our existing missions as appropriate. Again, we may not need all of these mission assignments, but if we need them, they'll be ready to go, so there aren't any delays. And Oregon Emergency Management has asked each of our state agencies to draft mission assignments so that they can be shared with all of our ESF sectors. Then where needed, we would deconflict our discrepancies, and where possible, we'll combine our similar resource requests so that we can create viable mission-ready packages for the state should a Cascadia event occur. So in closing, I just wanted to say that ClearPath 4 and the Cascadia Rising exercise last year were critical exercises that provided us opportunities to test our key components in our plan. We've learned many lessons, identified strengths, weaknesses, and gaps in our plan that we're currently still working on, and I think it's going to be a working document. And we also were able to increase our overall understanding of the federal response structure and how it specifically integrates with our Oregon Fuel Action Plan. And some of the highlights and takeaways are that in a catastrophic event, bulk fuel becomes a commodity that is automatically sent to the federal incident support bases in an impacted state. And that's not always the case with emergency scenarios that aren't catastrophic. So we also learned something extremely valuable during ClearPath 4, which is getting to sit in the same room with industry, our federal agencies, and the military to walk through how bulk fuel supplies would be obtained and delivered into Oregon. A fuel task force was actually convened in DC, and we participated in coordination calls to address our fuel needs, priorities, and concerns. So that was really helpful. Also, during ClearPath 4, we learned that FEMA maintains a fuel purchasing contract that allows the Defense Logistics Agency to purchase bulk fuel for our military operations in support of our civilian emergencies. So that was very helpful for the Oregon Military Department to understand that purchasing agreement. And then finally, the final takeaway was that the federal ISB that we work with during these exercises was the Redmond Airport in Deschutes County. So that helped us solidify some of our planning and make it more specific and practical. So, and I just realized that these exercises are very staff intensive and costly, but they're very helpful and effective in helping our state further our planning efforts for fuel. And that kind of wraps up my part of the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And we'll take questions at the conclusion of the presentations. And I would encourage those of you that do have questions to tee them up in the queue, and we'll take the questions that people have entered as we've gone along here first. And after that, we'll open up the microphones for those that would like to raise their hands, and we can open up their mics to ask a question directly. So let's move on to the presentation that I prepared. And if we can switch over to that. Okay, I think we have it up there now. Alex Marisi, who is head of energy security for the Michigan Agency for Energy, was going to do this presentation. I've been working with the state of Michigan recently to review some of their plans, and he asked me to go ahead and talk about some of the elements of their plan. I'm going to do that in a way that's sort of blended in with the guidance we've been providing historically, some of which I think needs to be updated and refined, and to discuss what model plans might look like. Now, I think it's important to emphasize that every state is faced with a different set of risk and potential consequences from an all hazards perspective. And clearly, Oregon with the Cascadia subduction zone is looking at a very, very severe scenario. However, a number of states have been looking at events that could potentially cause long-term power outages that could last for a month or even longer. And when we get into situations and scenarios like that, I think we're going to be seeing that we've exhausted a lot of our near-term contingency measures and may have to look at some longer-term, more well-developed plans to deal with the more severe shortages that occur under that scenario. It is likely, as we found out in Liberty Eclipse, the exercise conducted in Rhode Island in December of last year, that postulated a power outage caused by a major cyber attack that would virtually shut down every refinery along the East Coast, causing a fairly large supply shortage. Now, there is some demand destruction because people aren't going to work, so the demand is down, but nevertheless, as the power was begun to be restored, that demand would pick up and they would have lost a considerable amount of supply during that period. And so I think we need to be ready for these longer term potential risks. As a result, NASEO has taken upon the task of trying to develop some model plans for states. We're going to update some of the guidance that we've provided over the last several years, try to bring it together into one more holistic set of guidances that we hope states can use to provide greater levels of detail in their energy assurance plans as they move forward with updating those plans, which a number of states are doing. The petroleum response plan framework that we've outlined has all of the same elements that you've heard described by Joe and Deanna. I mean, clearly you need to have a good understanding of what events have occurred in your state historically and what's been done to address them, as well as to assess future risk. You need to define roles and responsibilities, as Joe outlined in his presentation. Who are the specific agencies involved? Who are the staff that are involved? Do they have the necessary training? What is the updates for that training? You need to understand what your linkages and coordinations will be with not only your state agencies, but as Deanna pointed out in her presentation, local governments as well. And what are the private sector plans? How are you coordinating with other states and the federal response plan? Because some of these events could well be multi-state in nature, and implementing measures in a consistent way across the states impacted by these events would allow for a more smooth, coordinated, and effective response. The information that Deanna provided about, identifying the locations and points of contact, and as Joe mentioned, the throughput of the petroleum infrastructure. You really need to know where your refineries are, and if they're not in your state, where are the refineries that supply your state? What are the pipelines used to move that product into your state? Do you rely on marine shipments, and if so, to what degree? Do you rely on rail? What are the primary rail points? Are there choke points in these distribution systems? So you need to understand that infrastructure and have a good description of it and understand the capacities and the flow. And then finally, you really need to be able to monitor petroleum supply. And as I think many of us know, understanding what refinery outputs are, tracking those on a monthly basis at a minimum, looking at what throughputs are happening in terms of pipeline, understanding what the demand is for fuel in the states and the shifts in demand that occur as we move from summer to winter grade gasolines, for example, is important to understand and know about. And pricing, of course, being a key indicator of when shortages can potentially demonstrate the effects of a shortage. One of the things that I wanted to mention, and this is really getting into the weeds, is the 782C report collected by the Energy Information Administration. This is a report from prime suppliers of the sales of petroleum products sold for final consumption within the state. And that's a very important statistic. They do publish that information at a state level monthly with some lag in the data, but you do have a good historical record for your states on terms of the refined petroleum products delivered for final consumption. A lot of states do use that for doing forecasting of petroleum demand. Michigan does produce, for example, a Michigan Energy Appraisal twice a year, where they do forecast both gasoline and distillate demand within the state, as well as looking at regional supply and demand pictures because they're reliant to a considerable degree on outstate refineries. It's interesting to note that this form also has within its instruction this second bullet that I've highlighted, noting that state energy office are vitally interested in receiving information that's contained on the 782C, and to ensure consistent reporting, respondents may provide a duplicate of each Form 782C directly to the appropriate state office. There are a number of states that do have state set-aside programs listed as among their contingency measures. Some of these plans are more detailed. Some of these plans really lack the necessary detail in order to quickly implement such a plan. The 782C form was originally the form that was used to identify the supply that was going to be set aside for each of the companies that was a prime supplier to the state, and also gives you the points of contact within those companies for those prime suppliers, which Joe mentioned was pretty important. This is information that I think is really vital for states to obtain. You can contact the Energy Information Administration and obtain a list of companies that are reporting supplies being delivered into your state, and then you can use that as a foundation for requesting these forms if you haven't already done so. I know a number of states do collect these forms at a company level, and if you don't do so, if you are ever faced with a serious petroleum shortage, this is a particularly important piece of information to have available to you to assess your supply situation. I would also mention that it is very important to make certain that, because this is sensitive marketing information at a company level, to make certain that you have provisions within your Sunshine or Freedom of Information Acts that exempts this information from disclosure, or in as much that it is confidential business information or trade secrets. Sometimes that can be obtained under a pledge of confidentiality by your chief executive officer. You certainly want to explore how you can protect this information from disclosure if you're going to take possession of it. The form actually looks like this, and I just put this up as you can see the various breakdowns of refined petroleum products that are reported. So you get a pretty detailed look at what's going on for each month. Now, it's important to understand that these reports are for the preceding month in which the fuel was delivered. So you're looking at historical data only. At one point, this form did contain projected sales for the upcoming month. And for the purposes of a state set-aside program, you would probably have to request for an addendum to this form that would provide not only the historical sales from the prior month, but the anticipated supply to be delivered in the upcoming month that you would then use to base your allocation decisions upon. And I think that, this is an area that I wanted to really get into some detail here, because it's really a fundamental piece of information to help you manage a petroleum shortage. When looking at petroleum response plans, we've typically described them as falling within the two categories those associated with managing supplies and assuring central public needs are met, and those that are related to trying to curtail demand or reduce overall demand. You'll see a number of items here that most states are familiar with, including the waivers of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, environmental waivers for fuel specs, and then there are other waivers like weight limits and, as Deanna mentioned, the Jones Act waivers for foreign flag tankers. But there are some other programs that states, if they have not developed them, may wish to consider. Priority End User Program, which is a program that would be used if the majority of the suppliers to your state had placed everyone on allocations and had gotten to a situation where they had cut off all non-contract customers and were then only selling contract customers some percentage of their actual contract volumes because they could not otherwise meet their contractual obligations. If you're in that type of situation, which would be a pretty serious, type of problem, you could have a program where the governor could just simply say that the police, fire, and emergency medical services get 100% of their requirements upon certification of their supplier at the prevailing price. So that's one of the programs that states might consider. We've talked about the state set-aside program a little bit. This is a program that sets aside a percentage of the fuel available for delivery in the month, and it can be reallocated to essential public service needs or other priorities as may be necessary given the nature of the problem. For example, you may have a major ice storm and it may be necessary for snow removal crews to be getting priority. Or there may be other kinds of priorities that have to be addressed given the nature of the consequences that you're dealing with. One area where we have a gap that is somewhat notable in a lot of plans is increasingly we've seen local governments move away from having their own storage tanks. Many still do, but smaller communities tend to rely more on buying fuel at the retail level. They're then just in the mix with everybody else, and if there's lines at gas stations, how can you manage that so you can assure that needs met through that type of a supply arrangement can be met? And it may be necessary to think about designating some specific pumps at certain critically located gas stations with an agreement of that owner and operator to provide those essential public service needs. As Joe also mentioned, there's been a number of undertakings recently to assure that that there's generators at gas stations, gas station generator programs and supply hookups. There are other programs to assure supplies of gas stations on evacuation routes in those parts of the country that are more prone to hurricanes. Deanna mentioned about the Defense Logistics Agency, which can respond to requests through FEMA under a federal declaration and can provide some amounts of fuel, but those amounts of fuel can be somewhat limited, and we're going to develop some more information about what their capacity is because in a major shortages, they certainly can't provide enough fuel to replace the full scope of the shortfall that might occur under most of the scenarios that we've examined. There are also contractual provisions for fuel supplies and emergencies, which we've detailed in our petroleum supply options for states. A copy that's available on the NASEO website, and we can provide a link to that. But looking at whether or not there's some surge provisions within your state contracts, some states have done that. Might be a useful way to look at how you can do that. Expanded fuel storage or strategic reserves is an expensive option, but New York State has decided to move forward with having a strategic gasoline reserve so they are assured supplies in a critical emergency. And then finally, if you do have a number of alternative fuel vehicles in your state vehicle fleet, how can those potentially be reassigned to take advantage of those availability of those fuels if gasoline and diesel fuel is in short supply? On the demand side, there's a number of things you can do. Certainly public information on emergency conservation actions, whether it be for home heating fuels or for transportation fuel, you want to have those available. Increasingly, we're seeing new resources become available, gasbuddy.com during the Colonial Pipeline incident was able to turn on a feature that allowed social media to track where stations were opened and closed. That's a pretty interesting capability. You need to be ready to put out safety guidance on keeping warm and the use of generators. Warming and cooling shelters. I didn't get the ESF numbers down, but these might be the responsibilities of the mass care or public health ESF 12 functions. But you want to know how those work because certainly many states have been using them in these 90-degree weathers we've been seeing recently. And, you know, when we've had shortages during the winter, those warming shelters have also opened up. What can you do with ride sharing, van pooling, increased use of mass transit to take the load off of individual vehicle use needs to be considered, and certainly just home energy savings recommendations that you can do in your own home. What we have suggested in the framework that we put forward, and you know, this is subject to potentially some revision, is that for each of these contingency measures, it would be useful for states to provide this level of detail. So there's a program element. What is the measure? What's it intended to do? When should it be used? What's the legal authority? How do you coordinate that? What are the touch points for the implementation at? How do you actually implement it? What's it going to cost, or what are the resource requirements, policies and procedures, lead times, and so forth? And I think if you were to take these contingencies measures and try to detail them and answer the questions to each of these categories, you're going to have a much more well-developed plan than those plans that have not gone into this level of detail. Impact assessments, I think, can be important because, you know, the governors are often going to say, well, what's this going to get me? You know, how effective might this be? You know, who's going to be affected? Is there economic or financial impacts and so forth? Part of your risk management is understanding when you would use these things and where they may have been used in the past. Understanding what are measures to indicate that they are working or not working. You know, these are some of the key things that should be part of your planning. And as Deanna mentioned in their mission assignments, you know, they're really looking ahead to detail out, you know, exactly how things, you know, would work. And I think that's important. So to give you a sample of this, this is what one measure might look like. And I'm not expecting people to read all this, but just to get a sense of what that might look like. This is an adaptation from the Michigan Petroleum Shortage Response Plan from 2013. They're working on updating their plan now, but as you can see here, there's a description, the intent is covered, who's covered by it, when should be used, what are the legal authorities. These are all important aspects to address, but you don't have to necessarily go into excruciating detail. At least having this level of information can be very helpful in moving these measures forward. And Alex mentioned to me today that, you know, they've actually been working on going through these plans and using these plans to detail their response to, you know, how they're going to implement things. So here's implementation procedures, operational considerations, what kind of information you're going to need, how quickly does things have to be done, how do you handle disputes, and so forth, how do you evaluate the program, cost and operations. I'm thinking costing these contingencies might be difficult, but identifying the resources required to put them in place is something that certainly makes sense to do. Identifying advantages and disadvantages, and what are the supporting documents, such as a draft executive order, appeals procedures, and other forms you might use to put such programs into effect. So here's an example of an executive order for the implementation of a priority end user plan. Every state has different formats that they use for legal documents and executive orders. These would be adapted, of course, to the ones which are the ones used within your states. But this is an example of an executive order. In fact, this was one that Alex told me they moved forward today in the exercise to the executive office with some tweaks and addition as part of the exercise they're working on right now. So that really kind of covers, gives you a sense of maybe some of the greater depth of detail that are needed. What we have seen in our review of energy assurance plans is that sometimes the petroleum sector planning is not as detailed as it might be, and we're hopeful that the initiative we're going to undertake this summer will allow states to assist us in developing plans that might better meet their needs and provide models for states as they update their plans over the coming months. We intend to work through the NASEO Energy Security Committee and may well develop a working group, which is subject to the approval of the co-chairs of that committee, and we're having a call at the end of the month to decide on that. But if that's something that you're interested in assisting with, we'd certainly be welcome to hear from you. I would also say that if you're aware of elements of other state energy assurance plans or of your energy assurance plans that you think would be helpful to bring forward as models that should be perhaps considered, we'd be happy to hear from you in that regard as well. And here's my contact information if you'd like to contact me with any ideas you might have at that point. So that really concludes my presentation for this afternoon. And let me turn to Shamika now to see if we've received any questions from the audience.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of questions. Alice Lippert asked, and this is for Joe, how many total gas stations are there in New Jersey?
That's a very good question. We've looked at several reports, and each time you get a different number. I can tell you that we've tasked our GIS people to locate and GPS every gas station in the state, and we're about at 90%. We feel 90%, between 90 and 95% confidence rate that we have 2,300 gas stations in the state. Obviously, that number changes all the time. Stations get sold, stations get closed. They get shelved for a while because of tank issues. So they may be closed for a year, maybe 2 years. So that number moves all the time, and I'm sure it moves all the time in other states, especially when you have a environmental protection agency looking over their shoulder. There are always issues with gas stations, but we have a number about 2,300, somewhere between 22 and 2,300 gas stations.
And this is Jeff. I would just add that in a lot of states, the weights and measures divisions, which are in various state agencies, sometimes within the Department of Agriculture, do register gas stations in a number of jurisdictions. So in those states, they probably got a little better count. But you're right, Joe, those stations kind of come and go over the course of a year or two. So that number does move around a bit.
Jeff, if I could just add about weights and measures, we also looked at weights and measures here in New Jersey. The problem with weights and measures and with a lot of other agencies who track that data is that the gas station owner normally provides their location of business and their corporate name, and that is not the name of the gas station on site. So there was always some confusion. Some owners who own multiple gas stations, a franchise of multiple gas stations, will give you one address, and they in reality have a dozen or so gas stations. So weights and measures was one source of information, but unless you actually look at each one individually and sort of dissect it to see, okay, who owns it and where is it and what is the name of the gas station, that is a pretty intensive job. So it hasn't been easy for us, is what I'm trying to say.
It kind of depends on the state. I know some states, they do get the exact station location and they actually send inspectors out. So they're required to know the actual name of the station and its physical location and apply stickers once their pumps have been inspected. So it depends on the regulations within the state.
True.
Great. So the next question is from Rajiv from Illinois, and he asks, and this is for Joe again, what is the standard capacity for this backup generator for the gas station?
Well, the backup generator is it's a diesel generator. I want to say I looked at those numbers a few weeks ago and they escape me right now. But the backup generator is designed to power the pumps. So if you have a convenience store and pumps as well, which we do, we have several gas stations like a Wawa here in New Jersey, which has many pumps and the convenience store. It's not designed for the convenience store. It's designed for the pumps only. So it's a portable generator. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but we offer, our emergency management team purchased 2 types of generators, and I want to say 75 kilowatts, but I don't know the exact number off the top of my head. But it's designed to support the pumps with diesel fuel, and obviously the station owner would supply their own diesel fuel. So.
Okay, great. So the next question is for Dina. How do you update the fuel database? Is that a county by county data call?
You know, we collected our data for our fuel database from the Department of Agriculture's Weights and Means Division, as well as from the Oregon State Fire Marshal's Office and the Department of Environmental Quality. So these folks collect data annually, and some of the most helpful data came from Department of Environmental Quality, because they have annual permits that retail service outlets have to apply each year and identify location, contact information, and those very specific, how many tanks are on site, what kind of fuel is there. They don't have backup power capacity and those kinds of data, but we just kind of combined all 3 of these databases, and we picked and kind of made it more concise to pull out the information that we needed to meet our specific fuel allocation needs, and then it's all listed by county.
Okay. Wait, hold on. I think it's the last question. Actually, it's not. Doug from Minnesota asked, Joe, how did you go about collecting data on fuel depots, fueling stations, number and capacity of tanks, etc.?
Is the question referring to the terminals, or is this on the retail side, or is he asking about the terminal facilities?
He does not specify.
Could you just repeat the question again?
Sure. How did you go about collecting data on fuel depots, fueling stations, number and capacity of tanks, etc.?
Well, okay. I guess I can try and answer that. I mean, the tanks themselves, the terminals, we actually reached out. Once we identified who they were, we have about 20 commercial rack terminals in the state, and they're owned by, again, integrated oil companies and storage and supply companies like Buckeye or Sunoco. So we actually reached out to them by letter, and we used our statute to cite. We cited our statute for needing that information, which was very helpful, because a lot of these companies are not regulated by any state agency on the supply chain side. I mean, they'll argue that they're heavily regulated on environmental issues, but not on supply and storage issues. So we actually sent a letter to each of these terminal facilities and asked them politely for certain information. We also sent letters to our prime suppliers asking politely for information on capacity and storage and contact and that sort. So we used our statute. We cited our statute for allowing us to collect information, and I'm happy to say that we got about a 95% positive response.
Okay. Next question is from Joanne in Massachusetts. Is there one agency in charge of updating the database? I'm assuming that is for Dina.
Yes, there is. Well, the 3 databases will be updated annually through DEQ and Oregon State Fire Marshals and the Department of Agriculture's Weights and Measures Division. And as they get their updates annually, we will take that data and update ours annually.
Okay. Next question is, on Also from Joanne, private companies are willing to help out in an emergency, but want to get paid. How does your state, who's asking for help with emergency services, handle the financial aspects with private companies?
I'm sorry, who's that question to?
Maybe both of you. If both of you guys could answer the question. Joe, if you want to answer first.
Well, yeah, that's actually a good question. During Sandy, when the private companies, I'm assuming they're talking about distributors, jobbers, and just the fuel suppliers in general. They were allowed to come back later and get paid sort of retroactively for any deliveries that were outside of their normal contract. I mean, as you know, these companies have contracts with existing commercial customers, and if we ask them to divert from their normal routine, they were allowed to come back and ask to get paid based on whatever the prevailing rate was, at the time.
Okay, great. Dina?
So similar to Joe's explanation, but also the other option is some of our counties, in the Oregon plan, the state provides the bulk fuel supplies to those designated fuel points, and then the county's responsibility to build a distribution plan to get that fuel from the fuel point to their emergency responders in the field and to critical facilities. So some of the counties have contracted with local distributors to do that work for them, and they've worked out the funding agreement and reimbursement and those things specifically via the county.
Okay, great. So we don't have any other questions in the chat pane. I have one hand raised. Alice Lippert, I will unmute you in a second, but if anyone else has a question that they would like to ask the presenters directly, just please click the raise hand icon, and I can recognize you once Alice has asked her question. Alice, you are unmuted.
Hi. This is Alice. I'm sorry, I did that by accident, so I have no further questions.
Okay. I don't see any other raised hands or any questions that have been entered into the chat. So Jeff, do you want to close out?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you all for joining us today. We will be posting this webinar, so those that weren't able to join us today can have access to it. We'll try to get some of these other questions of clarification that people ask for. We'll try to get some supplemental information up there as well. We do look forward to hearing from you in terms of things that you think would be helpful, in particular in terms of developing these model contingency plans. Our tentative schedule is to try to reorganize the material that we've produced over the course of the last 7 years and consolidate it to a greater degree as more models that states can use. Tentatively looking towards the end of the summer to get the draft done, and then we'll move into a period of public and comments from the other sectors. So that's the plan on that front. Again, thank you for joining us today. If there's no further questions, that'll conclude our webcast. I hope you found this helpful, and look forward to future webcasts on similar topics in the future from NASEO. Thank you again.